Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has your lecture notes on voters and voter behavior. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to the correct part for today's lesson and to fill in any key content that happens to appear throughout your notes by filling in the blanks and or answering any key concept questions that happen to appear throughout the doc as well. Before we get started, please let me also explain why this part of the lesson matters and why this part of the unit matters too. We can learn a lot about voters and voter behavior by understanding key traits and characteristics and demographic information, but the whole big picture here is to understand more about the ideologies of voters and what matters to them most, and also what might matter to you when you do become a voter in our democracy. So let's go ahead and get started, and here are some things that I want you to know about voters and voter behavior. The history of voting rights in America is rather long and complex. Simply put, suffrage is the right to vote. It is true that not every single demographic group in America got the right to vote at the same time. The electorate is also really important too, which is the potential voting population. I'm an example of the electorate because in theory I could vote and I'm registered to vote, and of course I do in fact show up to vote. Now, the framers of the Constitution purposely left the qualifications for voting up to the states, and so in many ways, I guess you could say this is the 10th Amendment at work, and over time, different states pursued different agendas for expanding the electorate, at least in their own image, how they saw fit. The 10th Amendment is also not just important for voters' rights, but it was also important for different types of stipulations with voting as well, from things that used to be in place, like poll taxes and literacy tests and other things as well, which we'll get into a little bit later. So approximately 210 million Americans are currently eligible to vote, which is a pretty sizable chunk of our population. Once again, an American citizen has to be 18 years and older to vote, and also the 15th Amendment in 1870 said that no citizen can be denied the right to vote based on race. So in many ways, we're going to look at some of the key provisions now that expanded the voting electorate to be what it is today. This is one of the biggest things that made that so. Additionally, the 19th Amendment, if you recall from our unit on the Constitution, allowed women the right to vote too. It said that no citizen can be denied the right to vote based on their sex. So in many different ways, this also expanded the voting electorate to what we know as today. Another key thing to remember when it comes to the history of voting rights here is that the 23rd Amendment gave voting rights to the people of Washington, D.C., which essentially gave them not just the right to vote, but a chance to have a stake in the Electoral College. And the 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, was really important because it eliminated the poll tax. If you recall what this is a sum of money that was due to a polling location, which was pretty much put in place to suppress the black vote in the Deep South. The 26th Amendment was then passed in 1971, which lowered the voting age to 18, which is what we know of it to be today. So as you can see over time, and some would say also under pressure too, by societal and cultural norms, the voting electorate has greatly expanded in the United States of America. But what are the requirements for voting? Here they are. Simply put, there are some universal requirements that you must meet to be a voter in the United States. You obviously have to have citizenship. You obviously have to be of age, of the legal age for the right to vote. You obviously have to have residence. Residence in your district, residence in your area upon which you have registered as. And this is really important too. You can't just show up to any polling location. You have to, of course, have a specified polling site, which we'll get into later. And here are some other requirements for voting as well. Aliens or foreign-born residents who have not become citizens, once again, generally denied the right to vote, but it's not necessarily in the Constitution. So we're still having this discussion today about what types of immigrants should be able to vote and partake in our democratic processes. As you're aware, the key dialogue or narrative here is that many people are pushing for greater advocacy of equality for aliens and or illegal immigrants. Now, Western states used to allow aliens the right to vote to attract settlers, but this is something that, of course, has dramatically changed throughout our understanding of the word alien and what that means, and also considering the fact that just so many people are so heated over the topic of illegal immigration anyway, this is probably something we're going to be talking about for a while. Some other things to keep in mind about residency is that you must be a legal resident of the state that he or she wishes to vote in. So as I alluded to in a previous slide, you have to, of course, have a legal residency. This prevents interest groups from bussing in and out state voters to influence the outcome of state or local elections, which when you think about it, it makes sense. So if there was a controversial heated election here in Pennsylvania, this would prohibit people from New Jersey and New York coming in to vote in certain polling locations to follow the results. This is also meant to allow new voters to become familiar with candidates or issues of their states or districts, As you're aware, no one state is exactly like another. So having residency in that state allows you the chance to be more in touch and more in tune with what's actually happening there. And the Voting Rights Act of 1970 allowed Congress to ban the residency requirement for more than 30 days. So this is something that has dramatically changed our whole notion of, well, what does it mean to be a resident of an area? And keeping in mind that sometimes people are always on the move from point A to point B. So this, of course, helps the electorate, at least in their eyes. Now, in terms of Pennsylvania residency laws with the right to vote, here's some things for you guys to keep in mind. To vote in Pennsylvania, you must be a citizen of the United States for at least a month, a full month, and a resident of the state for at least 30 days. And once again, that in many ways is a full month. Additionally, you must reside in the district that you're voting in. This is incredibly important too. When you think about voting for your district representative for the House of Representatives, of course you have to live in that district to vote for that said person. In terms of age here, the 26th Amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote, which we talked about here, but the backstory behind this is quite interesting. The Vietnam War, which was taking place at the time, many people chanted the mantra, if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. And so before this, the voting age was generally 21. And so what happened here is that because of pressure and with the draft that was being put in place, thus forcing young men to leave their homes and fight for our country, many people viewed that as responsible and, capable enough to vote. Let's take a few moments to talk about the non-voter in America. So this is kind of funny, but it's definitely true. The word idiot comes from the Greek root idiotes, which means not those citizens who do not vote. And so in this way, this is referring to people who definitely do not partake in that democratic right. If you recall from a previous unit, we talked about this and how Greece was one of the first democracies that existed in our world. In fact, they had a direct democracy where people voted directly for the outcome. So in many ways, people who don't vote are definitely people who have been ostracized from this process. Tens of millions of Americans do not vote. And so that number is quite high and staggering when you think about democracy and what it's required to have popular rule by the people. But why don't people vote? This answer is also quite complex as well. They might be physically unable to get to the polls. In fact, that's about 5 to 6 million Americans as we speak. And once again, physically refers to maybe their health condition or maybe just upon where they live and not having the proper aid to get from point A to point B. Some people also might be traveling during elections, and so they have to, in advance, fill in an absentee ballot, which of course pertains to about 2 to 3 million people in a normal year. And in a mental health care facility, this number is kind of staggering here. It refers to 500,000 of Americans. So people who might be in some type of mental health care facility will not have a chance to vote. People might be incarcerated or in jail, and this of course refers to 2 million Americans, and that number is pretty high too. So if you do the math here, this is a substantial portion of the United States voting population, and so having them not vote could in fact affect the result here, if you will. Now, why people don't vote? These answers are somewhat complex, but when you think about it, it makes sense. Many just choose to not vote. It's your right to not vote. Many think that their vote doesn't make a difference, so therefore why should they try? Why should they care? Some are content with the political world as it is, and they would say, I'm just a little bit of a trickle in the big pond of the political world, so what difference does my vote make? Some distrust all of politics and politicians in general, so the reason why they might not vote is because they think it's a messy system and they don't want to get involved with that. And it really comes down to people's political efficacy, which is a word that means one's own influence on effectiveness on an outcome. So for example, in school right now, in this cyber hybrid environment, if you have efficacy, that means you have the determination and the mindset to think that I am the author of my own fate this year and I'm going to make it what it is. And voters kind of should experience the same thing too. I'm the author of my democracy in my country and my vote makes a difference. But not everybody views it that way. And once again, to go back to your example, not everybody views schoolwork that way. Inconvenient polling also takes place too. What I mean by that is that there's difficult election procedures across our nation, which makes it tough to vote. Registration requirements are somewhat convoluted and complex, and the long ballots to fill out also are a little bit confusing too. When you actually vote for the first time, you'll understand what I mean by this. The lines at the polls can be somewhat elongated, and especially when you're trying to just get home to your family after a long days of work, the voting might be the last thing that you want to prioritize there. And there's also this construct called the time zone fallout, which basically means that polls in states like in the Eastern and Central time zones close way before the Mountain and Pacific time zones. And so many people might see the results coming in early and go, oh, well, the election's going this way. I'm not going to vote. And, in many ways, that type of apathy affects the way that people view the election. And of course, the media is a big part of this too, because they broadcast the election results in real time. So it usually comes down to just a general lack of interest for people who just don't vote. Which, I guess when you think about it yet again, these things do make sense for our voting electorate. Now, these charts, once again, I'll post to Classroom for you, but this explains who actually votes in America and some voting patterns that you might see across demographics, which we're going to talk about in the next part of our notes right here. So don't worry, you'll see these images later. But let's talk about voter behavior now. Please proceed to the next section, and then you shall fill in the rest of your notes as well.